This is the Robeson tomato. Also known as the Russian heirloom tomato, it has the same shape and proportion of any garden variety tomato, but is made unique by its dark, pigmented skin, making it an anomaly in the gardening community. An ignorant gardener may mistake the mature fruit as rotten, when its characteristically dark color is a sign of healthy growth. As a beefsteak tomato, its taste and texture are described as thick and hearty, and is viewed as a must-grow seed in any grower's collection. Its claim to fame, however, is the legendary 20th century actor and civil rights activist it's named after, Paul Robeson, and the two have more in common than you might think. Paul Leroy Robeson was born on April 9, 1898 in Princeton, New Jersey. Born the youngest to the runaway slave turned respected Presbyterian minister William Robeson, Paul was taught social justice at an early age, one of which lessons came in the form of his father William losing his facility and congregation after a dispute with the white financial backers of his church, with racism being prevalent in Princeton at the time, forcing William to do menial labor to make ends meet. This would culminate in William ultimately having to move the entire family into a crowded store attic in Westfield. Despite family hardship, William's son Paul would become a high achiever. After graduating Rutgers University as valedictorian and a short stint as a member of a New York law firm, he began his acting career overseas in the early 1920s, touring shows like Emperor Jones and All God's Chillin' Have Wings in the UK. Even early on, Paul was viewed as a generational talent and a staple of a movement that would be known as the Harlem Renaissance. His style is described as warm but commanding, and was known for his dark complexion, stature, but more than anything else, his voice. His unmistakable sound that would become iconic for his time was known to breathe life and pain into every song he sang, ringing true with the struggle of many black people across the country. His calling card, Old Man River, a song about the futility of time passing, honestly, speaks for itself.
There's an old man called the Mississippi. That's the old man that I'd like to be. What does he care?
His career and the era of blackface and other widespread degradation of African Americans in media was distinguished by his dignified portrayal of all his roles, making you feel the humanity in his characters. Having broken barriers in the world of theater and the newly invented talkie film format, Robeson found himself friends with America's elite, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, Harry Truman, and even Eleanor Roosevelt. With all that he accomplished in the early days of cinema, which would go on to become the most popular form of American media, it became one of Hollywood's great tragedies that Paul Robeson would die
canceled and pushed into historic obscurity.
Side note, did you know Paul Robeson was an accomplished athlete? As only the third black student in Rutgers' 149-year-long history, Roby would go on to be considered as one of the greatest college players of his era. A two-time All-American from 1915 to 1919, Robeson, as the only black man on campus, would become its biggest star. Although this didn't come without its challenges. About 2 weeks before officially joining Rutgers' football team, a 17-year-old Robeson was brutally assaulted by his white teammates on the practice field, dislocating his shoulder and breaking his nose. In another incident, after one of Robeson's classmates stomped on his hand in an attempt to break it, Paul lifted him over his head, threatening to kill him, only to put him down gently after being reminded he represented the school as a member of the varsity team. Unsurprisingly, the majority of the hatred came from the school's rivals, with Robeson even being benched in a match against Washington and Lee after they threatened not to share the field with a black player. Rutgers complied so as not to risk controversy on its 150th anniversary. Robeson was active in what could be considered to be the most politically contentious time in American history, with the rivalry between the capitalist US and communist Soviet Union escalating following the Second World War. America was facing growing tension both externally and domestically. The civil rights movement in the United States was picking up traction due to the leadership of notable figures such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. Meanwhile, McCarthy-era communist paranoia was in full effect within the government, especially targeting members of the media. Robeson, being on record advocating for radical social changes such as racial equality and workers' rights, was often speculated to be a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, an act widely viewed as treason at the time. However, Robeson, being the child of a former slave, didn't let anything stop him from helping the members of the labor class. In what was known as the Summer of Soup and Speeches, or the General Strike of 1926, Paul Robeson famously allied himself with the Welsh miners after they were blacklisted from working following a crushing union defeat. Robeson stood with them, donated to their cause, and even sang to the men on multiple occasions, despite already being a world-class talent by the time he made it to Britain. When pressed during an interview as to whether he was or not a filthy commie, Robeson flatly declined to answer the question, citing his right as an American citizen to vote for any candidate that best serves his interests. He even claimed that the Communist Party is a political party no different than the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, and that communism deserved a chance to compete in the marketplace of ideas. Paul Robeson would pay for this sentiment for the rest of his life. Not unlike his collegiate football career, Paul Robeson's biggest detractors were usually on his same team. Robeson in the latter half of his life became known for his adversarial relationship with the U.S. government. In a storied meeting between Robeson and sitting U.S. President Harry S. Truman, Truman allegedly stormed out after Robeson suggested that black people, without the passing of an anti-lynching law, would be forced to protect themselves following the lynching of 4 black men in Georgia. Aside from advocating for the armed protection of black people, Robeson was also an outspoken ally of the Soviet Union, publicly speaking on their behalf on numerous occasions. His ties to the USSR became so alarming to the US government that following the backlash of a misquote from one of his speeches at a peace rally in Paris, Paul Robeson's US passport was revoked, his name was removed from the list of all US football teams, and records and newsreels of his storied career were destroyed. On top of that, he was called in to testify in 1956 to the infamous House of Un-American Activities Committee, where he refused to meaningfully answer any questions or name anyone who may potentially be communist. After a lengthy legal battle, Robeson did eventually get his passport back, where he was welcomed back with open arms in Moscow. Now, what does that long, sad story have to do with tomatoes? Well, much like the man they were named after, Robeson tomatoes' value are often measured by their external appearance, a state of being that is, by its very definition, natural, but seem as a unique defect to the untrained eye, despite having the same flesh as its counterpart, mistakenly put into a category of its own. So despite growing in the same conditions, in the same environment, on our same soil, did Paul Robeson grow wrong? Was his fully grown self that different from what we had already seen? Was his existence a threat to the growth of the community? If he was he always? When did he become so? What was he threatening? Who was he threatening? Was he allowed to grow into his final form? Did we nip the bud too early? Why did we nip the bud at all? Now that he's gone, completely eradicated from our garden, what kind of mark did he leave on the soil that birthed him? Could a seed like his ever grow again?
Once called the tallest tree in our forest, we owe it to ourselves to seed, plant, water, and grow. Like Paul.